On behalf of the partner institutions of the STIP Forum Lecture Series, I warmly welcome you all to this 24th STIP Forum Lecture. We have lost some time, so I will make the usual introduction short. This is a monthly lecture on topics which are selected jointly by the institutions which are participating in it. You will see the full details of the lecture in this leaflet. About today's lecture, first of all, we have a very eminent person to chair the session, Mr. Ajay Shankar, IAS 1973 batch, and he has been at the center of India's responses to global economic crisis and modernizing India's economy, and a vast range of experience in reform, including labor laws and some difficult issues. He's also been a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington and has a master's in economics from Georgetown University, Washington, and he's a senior distinguished fellow at TERI. As the main speaker, we have Professor Michael Grubb from UCL, University College London. His details are already there. I will just add a little bit about his main areas of research interest: energy innovation, design of efficient and effective market structures and support systems, integration of renewable energy sources into existing systems, carbon pricing and emissions trading systems, and international climate change issues. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are meeting at an interesting time. IPCC 50 has issued its report on land use impact, IPCC 51 on the oceans and cryosphere. They all warn of climate stress, and they are a challenge for the next COP25 in Chile. Extreme climate events causing loss and suffering, everyone knows about it, including our Chief Minister in Bihar. A UN conference on desertification has also given some very depressing outlooks. The health of the oceans is being compromised. There is a high seas treaty under negotiation. There are interlinked and multiple challenges arising from human activity before us. SDG 2030 goals are still far ahead, as the UN high-level meetings indicated. Youth is becoming increasingly impatient with the failure of global governance systems to address challenges. So with this background, I would request Shri Ajay Shankar to take charge of the meeting. Thank you.
First of all, let me welcome all of you. And this is a monthly series, but the topic of today's lecture, as well as the person giving it, make it a very special lecture. And I would also like to spare you the burden of apologizing for being a little late, because Delhi's traffic and what we are all familiar with, VIP movement, can send any well-planned travel itinerary out of sorts. So he's been adventurous. I believe you took a three-wheeler to come here.
I walked half the way and got a tuk-tuk the rest of the way.
So that's...
It got me here, eventually.
But the subject on which we're going to spend applying our minds to for the next 45 minutes or so, I hope, is one which is at the center of what I would call the solution to the climate change problem globally, which is innovation and policy. So whatever hope there is today, and today there is greater hope in some circles than there was 10 years back, is a result of whatever innovation and technology have delivered. In terms of government and government policies, we are yet to see the kind of movement which is needed and which civil society has been wanting. But here again, I think there is the first signs of optimism, my view, where both UK and France in their parliaments have said that by 2050 they will be net carbon neutral. So it's the first time some major nation or an economy has said that. And to achieve that, it will be difficult, and innovation and policy will have to drive it. And we in India, for us, this is even more important because we are at an early stage in all this. And some of us would like to believe that underdevelopment gives you some possibility of leapfrogging. And so it's up to us to leapfrog as best as we can. And if we do want to leapfrog, and we should, and our Prime Minister is committed to it, he's ambitious, he keeps saying that in all forums, then innovation and policy would be what would enable us to leapfrog successfully and effectively. So with these few words, may I request Professor Michael Grubb to enlighten us.
Thank you very much for those kind and very thoughtful introductory remarks. So I'm actually not going to talk directly about climate change or the multiple interrelated challenges to which you referred, because I know here at the Habitat Centre there's a sophisticated audience on many of these issues. I thought what might be of interest is to focus, particularly given the title of this lecture series, on which many congratulations, to focus on innovation-related issues, but set those against a backdrop of primarily UK and European experience, and then how that has affected at least my own understanding of innovation processes and dynamics. So I am well aware that every country is different. Some lessons can be transferred, some are completely irrelevant. Some you might think, well, it would work very differently, but there's some interesting points. But I think that one thing about innovation is it has to be grounded in some experience, because, to be honest, economics as it stands today, traditionally taught, actually has surprisingly little that's helped us in real economic of innovation processes and the policies. So I'm going to start just with one slide on a bit of the global picture, although I will make perhaps quite a controversial remark in that. I'm then going to move pretty quickly on to more the European and UK experience. Do we have any electricity experts in the room? Oh dear. Right.
I have dabbled in it.
I will try and say a little bit about. That's
Only hydro design.
not quite, but I'll try and explain a little bit about quite a radical change in the way that we've organised the UK electricity system, and then finally I'll move on to some more theoretical points about how I think we need to think about innovation in ways, more general ways that can then maybe be adapted for different contexts. Then, if I haven't taken too long, I'll finish by saying a little bit about the observation you just kindly made about the UK's commitment to net zero emissions. In grey at the bottom, do we have any macroeconomists in the room? Not really. That's fine. I'm not going to have time to cover the bit at the bottom anyway, so if you want an offline conversation, I'm happy to. I will say a little bit in that third section, mainly drawn from a book I published a few years ago, which is partly, well, you'll get the flavour as I go through. But I'm going to start with an exam question. What do the following energy technologies all have in common? Offshore, shale, gas turbines, solar, etc. I mean, I could ask, but I will offer at least two things, despite the fact they all look completely different. Actually, they all have in common that they've all turned out to be much cheaper than anyone really expected beforehand, ex ante. The other thing is, they all involved government action sustained at scale over many years on both the technology resource development and the demand price. So it doesn't matter, are you talking about finding more oil or developing renewable energy, they've all turned out to be cheaper when governments have made the effort to support major industrially based innovation. Now, one area that has been applied to is solar. Most people, by the way, like to put up quotes to support the case they're making. I have a strange habit of using quotes to do exactly the opposite. I put up quotes of things that I now vigorously disagree with. So it is only 5 years since The Economist declared that solar power is the most expensive way of reducing carbon emissions. Björn Lomborg said Germany has gone mad in its energy policy, and a German chief executive said that solar power in Germany makes as much sense as growing pineapples in Alaska. I should say the chief executive of RWE, that company has not done very well if you look at its share price over the last 5 years. May have something to do with its CEO's view of the world, because costs have come down dramatically. One thing that has gone on in that process at the top there is we moved through the various stages of what I call the innovation chain. It's pretty simple in a way. A real innovation expert will tell you that's much too simplistic. Innovation's more complicated and dynamic and feedbacks. But it is nevertheless true. And perhaps I made a reference to economics. Very long ago, there was sort of research and development and diffusion, or invention and diffusion. And then Schumpeter came along and said, well, there's invention and there's innovation and there's diffusion. And in my experience in the energy world, there's invention over there, there's diffusion over there, and there's a very long, complicated chain of an awful lot of things that have to happen to get from one to the other. If we now look a bit more specifically at some of this renewable story globally, what we have there is trends of costs in average auction prices of both solar and wind energy. That's the yellow and the blue. And I've now updated this slide with the auctions of solar PV this summer, where the world record for cheapest solar has been broken 3 times. Portugal has had the world's cheapest solar at £16 per megawatt hour. I'll say a little bit in a moment to give that some context. We all know that actually the cost of a technology also depends a bit on the environment, the regulatory stability and so forth. But even in sub-Saharan Africa, we've had an auction just this month. I am up to date. Last month, sorry. In Ethiopia, were an auction of £25 a megawatt hour. Battery costs have come down dramatically. So if we take that Economist quote from only 5 years ago, actually it now appears, correct me if I'm wrong, that solar energy is emerging as the cheapest widespread high-grade energy source in human history. Let me pause on that. First, to allow anybody who thinks I'm just wrong and disagrees. Be very happy. I may not know my energy history, but that looks to me like it is now true. And I think if it is true, we haven't really even begun to fully understand the implications. Oh, I have a hand up.
So, I'm just curious. These prices include the fact that
the variability?
Yeah, the variability.
The intermittency. So these are contract prices per kilowatt hour. So no, they don't include any penalty for variability. At the level of capacity currently installed, that doesn't matter very much, because frankly it's pretty still small compared to the fluctuations in electricity demand generally. And in fact, in most of these countries, they are summer peaking, air conditioning peaking, so actually it's a positive value. There's more solar when you need it for air conditioning. Of course, again, these things depend on the location and also on how much you've got. In Britain now, I wasn't going to go into the solar, but Britain, some of you may know, is not the sunniest country in the world. We started feed-in tariffs about 8-9 years ago when I was working at the energy regulator. Our projection was in 3 years' time we'd have 1.5 gigawatts, 1,500 megawatts installed. Actually, within 3 years, we had 10,000 megawatts installed, and the grid couldn't cope, and we had all of those kinds of
Could you just
problems.
repeat the numbers?
So,
You expected-
in England,
When did you begin?
I think 2011.
And expected just
Expected
about 1,000?
1,500 megawatts was our projections, only 3 years ahead. And we were astonished to discover we had 10,000. And then, of course, the government cut the feed-in tariffs radically, and it's all slowed down, but it's continued to grow. That's in Britain. I mean, you don't go to Britain to do solar energy. One point, yeah.
This is fine with regard to the generation cost of $16.
Yeah.
But what about the distribution price?
So that's going to depend on exactly where and how the PV plugs into the grid. I can't say I know the details of all of these projects, but the usual pattern is that the project developer has to pay for the connection to the appropriate level of the grid system, and whether that's distribution or transmission depends on how big the plant is. But those normally include the connection costs.
This is cyclical.
Hmm?
This is cyclical. This generation is cyclical. It is in the daytime, but the evening to night, when there is no generation,
Yeah.
you have to have backup generator.
Well, this was the point. I'm actually really happy that I did my PhD on intermittency and its incorporation. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I think it is, as I said, whilst the volume of solar energy is relatively modest compared with the scale of demand on the system, actually dollars per megawatt hour is a reasonable approximation. It's when you start to get a lot of correlated renewable energy that you start to worry about, costs of backup, the costs of the variability, etc. Very happy to either talk more or send some technical papers. But at the moment, I think dollars per megawatt hour, in most cases, is a good enough approximation. Our experience in Europe actually is you could get up to about 30 or 35% of electricity from wind and solar before the system costs start becoming something you really have to think about and have to adapt the system more. If I continue briefly on the high-level view of this, and this one is for the economists in the room against the backdrop partly that a significant part of this development, in my view, was driven by the German government. Well, actually, Japan put significant research and development effort in the 1990s. Then in Germany, we had what was called the Energiewende, the energy transition plan that was launched in 2000 and was basically a product of complicated politics in Britain, in Germany. The Green Party got power in Parliament, in coalition, and said no nuclear, and fairly soon said no carbon capture and storage, which meant the only option they had was to develop renewable energy. And the German government said, we're going to develop renewable energy at scale. And they probably put about 150 billion euros a year is now being paid for the German Energiewende. Many economists actually thought, just like that quote I showed, this is crazy. These things are really expensive. If you want to cut emissions, go and insulate a house or run a gas plant instead of a coal plant. It's a much cheaper way of cutting emissions. My colleague at Cambridge, David Newbury, who was the chair of the International Association of Energy Economists, with hindsight, he said, well, hang on a minute, maybe we were wrong, because we didn't actually factor in the benefits of learning by doing. And if you look back and do it still depends on the assumptions, but it's a reasonable estimate that the value of the learning and the cost reduction was much bigger than the actual value of the emission reductions themselves in the short run. So it's what an economist would call a learning spillover, which in this case was actually very large. I don't want to go into the details of the numbers. I've got the paper there, we can circulate the slides if you want to look at how he estimated that. What is going on here in terms of the innovation process? Well, one thing is we tend to have some quite simplistic caricatures. One of them, in fact, there's sort of two opposite stories that economists tell about innovation. One of which is, it's great, it's wonderful, we should spend much more on research and development. That will bring all the costs down, the thing on the left, and once it's really cheap, then we'll deploy it. Right? That's a very common view. The other view, the other caricature, is the opposite. It says, oh, we don't want governments involved at all, just change the market conditions, make it plain there'll be big values to anyone who comes up with a new technology, you'll force the market, and then the costs will all come down. Reality is nearly always in between, which is, yeah, the stuff's quite expensive, but you find for some reason you either support it or somebody wants to buy it for special reasons. You build up the scale, you get better, you build up the scale a bit more, you get more revenues, you kind of learn in repeated cycles, and you grow the technology in the industry and the supply chains and the market. You iterate your way down that curve of combined scale and cost reduction. Maybe just one word, I didn't include the data slide, but I am talking about energy and industrial innovation here. One thing I think striking is there can be big differences between sectors. So, and there are good reasons for that. Maybe I should have actually included a slide. But if you think about the iPhone, or this may actually be a Huawei phone, think about how much money they made. I mean, think about Apple, how much money it made from the iPhone. Extraordinary value, well worth spending a lot of money on R&D, because the rewards are enormous. Now think about low carbon technology innovation. This was relatively quick to develop as well. Low carbon technology innovation, actually it could be really expensive. You could spend a lot, and then you finally get the thing to work. You've maybe spent, £50 billion development, 10 years have gone by. You go to the market and say, hey, I've got a great new way of making exactly the same thing, which is electrons. How much money are you going to get by going to the consumer and saying, I've got a great new way of making electrons? If the sector does not have product differentiation, it will have very low innovation. And there are very clear statistics. The technologies like IT and pharmaceuticals, the sectors spend 10 to 15% of their total turnover on research and development. In energy, it's less than 1%. So if you're going to have innovation, states have to be involved. And the policy challenge is how can they effectively be involved to accelerate innovation. In that kind of context, if I take that concept of the innovation chain, and I will come back to this one last time towards the end of my talk, what you actually have to do is recognize you want to get from a novel technology to something that is mature and diffused, and that will involve a combination of market pull forces and technology push forces. And the challenge is always moving from one to the other, because it's never an easy or a total, it's not just one step. You tend, under technology push, to be more reliant on government forcing, government push, government funding, and market pull more reliant on the market generating your revenues and your feedbacks. But moving or graduating from one to the other is often not an easy policy challenge. And again, there's a reference there if you want to pick that up. So that was a sort of broad view on something that's happened globally, partly driven by the German Energiewende, and a first level of how to think about the innovation process. If I now come on to a bit about the European and UK policy story and where that has led us. So first to say the EU actually for the last 25 years, its major focus in energy policy was on energy liberalisation, introduce more competition into the sector. And it's been very successful that you can trade electricity freely across Europe. We are actually, as a continent, more integrated in electricity trading than the United States. That does require physical interconnection between countries across Europe. So Europe has supported interconnectors. And then it had this climate change stuff coming along and thinking, well, how do we tack this on? And in Europe, the approach adopted in 2008 was a series of targets for 2020. Some of you may know this. There was a target to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. Hasn't come out very clear, but to develop 20% of our final energy supplies from renewable energy, which implies quite a lot more than 20% in electricity, and to improve energy efficiency by 20%. Became known as the three targets approach. We actually also had the interconnectors level commitment. So it's been called the 20-20-20 by 2020 approach. And a lot of people said, well, this is stupid, because why would you want three different things if what you're basically trying to do is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And in addition, you kind of have a politics which says, well, member states retain control over their energy mix, but they've all signed up to those things as well. So we needn't go into the complexity of European governance. You may have noticed that there's been one or two problems arising, at least in terms of the UK's involvement. But I'm not going to talk about Brexit, please, for those who know. I'm going to talk, however, about UK energy policy and where we've got to. This chart shows a long view history of the mix of electricity supplies, the mix of fuels going into electricity since 1970. For the 1970s and 80s, Britain was sometimes described as an island of coal in a sea of oil and gas. Which sounds like a bit of a strange place to try and build a low-carbon economy. So how did that happen? Well, partly interesting accidents, partly having said it's great we have all this domestic energy supply and all of this domestic coal, the coal miners said it's great, we've got complete stranglehold over the UK economy, and went on a national strike that became extremely vicious and politically destructive, which meant the Conservative parties took it on as a mission to destroy the political power of the mining unions, and they privatised the electricity system to introduce competition as one way of breaking the structure of dependence. So that allowed two things to happen, one of which actually is the private electricity companies said, hey, why should we buy UK coal instead of foreign coal? Because foreign coal is cheaper. And the other thing that happened is other companies, and in particular supply companies, said, why should we rely on established coal fleet when we can build clean gas plants using gas from the North Sea, which was coming in? So the thing was actually structured in part to encourage entry of gas, and it was very effective. The yellow there is a remarkable, what we call the dash for gas in UK electricity system, a rapid reduction in coal use, and in particular UK coal mining. So from that perspective, it was actually fairly effective. I'm not going to get too much into details, but there really were problems with our centralised monopoly way until 1990, and privatising the system did achieve a lot of things, even if some of them were a bit brutal and some were very difficult, like the discovery that nobody was ever going to build nuclear power under a privatised electricity system. So the government simply failed, could not even sell existing nuclear plants, let alone get anybody private to build them. In 2000, the government changed the nature of electricity privatisation. There are different ways of organising a competitive system, as you probably know. I'm not going to go into details, except that it would take me on to issues I will explain in a moment. The sharp-eyed of you may know or notice that on the right-hand side of this, you seem to have suddenly a rather rapid growth of renewables and a very rapid collapse in coal generation, which is a story I will now tell you, because it is partly linked with what we call electricity market reform, which was a major change, another round of major regulatory reform in how we organise this sector. Why? And how did we get to a major reform? Well, it's partly because it reflected an intellectual struggle between idealised economic theory and emerging evidence, I'll explain in a second, but it was reflected in a rise of worries about lack of investment in the sector. At precisely the same time, when the government was saying we must decarbonise, and decarbonising is going to involve building a lot of renewables and nuclear energy, which is capital intensive and will cost £100 billion of investment during the decade of the 2010s. Previously, electricity power stations have been funded by electricity companies. This clearly was impossible for them to fund, which meant we were going to go to the capital markets, which meant that issues of perceived risk became central, and effectively the conclusion is this is not going to work. I was on the UK Climate Change Committee in 2008 when we published our first report. We said this structure is never going to deliver the very large volumes of capital intensive investment we need, and most low carbon is capital intensive and very cheap to run, renewables or nuclear. And it's a combination of reasons, but part of it, for the one or two electricity economists here, is the paradox about who takes the risk, right? If you work in if you're trying to raise private finance, the first question is, what's the risk? Tell me the risk and I'll tell you how much the money is going to cost you in interest rates. We created a system whereby if you built a coal or a nuclear plant, you spent a huge amount of money up front, it cost you nothing to run, your revenues depended upon the price of electricity tomorrow and the day after. And you have no idea what that might be. It will depend upon gas prices, fuel prices, carbon prices, other things over which you have no control whatsoever. So you have a very risky environment. And the paradox is the fossil fuel plant, the gas plant, basically is the one that drives the electricity price. So they were hedged against their own risks. Gas price doubles, well, it raises the electricity price because the marginal plant costs more to run. You put on a carbon price, that adds to the cost of running the gas plants, they add that to the electricity price, no problem. So the risks were all borne by the zero carbon, and so that's not going to work. But even aside from that, the energy regulator, Ofgem, actually said, well, never mind that, nobody's actually building anything, and yet we want to retire lots of coal plant, and the lights are going to go out unless we do something, because the whole market is too risky for actually any kind of investment, really. So eventually that view and concerns won out. We established this thing called electricity market reform. It was a 4-year program of legislative reform, and it had 4 main elements. Sorry, it may sound like this has gone some way from innovation, but I hope you will very soon see why I talk you through this story. Or at least I talk you through a part of it, not much of it. The 4 elements was something called a contract for difference. Actually, you needn't really worry about that. It's basically a fixed price electricity contract. It just says you'll agree with the government a fixed price per kilowatt hour that you will get for the next 15 years. It's called a contract for difference because basically says get your money from the market as much as you can and government will pay the rest. That's basic. It's very simple actually. We also established something called a capacity market, which was paying for generators who promised contractually to be available when they were needed, when the wind wasn't blowing or the sun, etc. So it's a capacity payment for firm power. We established a minimum carbon price in the system, the carbon price floor. And just in case that wasn't enough for anyone thinking of building a coal plant, we basically made it illegal. There's an emissions performance standard which said it's illegal to build anything dirtier than a gas plant. Now, what happened? Well, I'll show you two things that happened. One is a story around UK offshore wind energy. Now, I get the sense, quite rightly, there's some engineers in the room, lots of engineers. I had a bit of engineering. I know that building rotating machinery on a 100-metre tower in the middle of the North Sea is not a very easy thing to consider in engineering terms, and I would expect it to be relatively expensive. And when the government gave out its first contracts, they were indeed at about 100, you can't quite see it, but it's about £150 per megawatt hour. For delivery over for 3, 4, 5 years ahead. That's the sort of well, that dips down a little bit. But you know, the regulator looked at this and thought, yeah, this low carbon transition is going to be really expensive if this is what we have to do. 6 months later, they moved from negotiated contracts to an auction. It was for the technical, they basically said, we want this much offshore, who's going to pay how much, or who's going to need how much in order to promise to build, and you then run a competitive auction, and the price came in at about 112. That's within 6 months they moved, and the price came down that much. We thought, it's still a bit pricey, but you know, it's looking a bit more manageable. But there was then an election, a new government, Conservative government said, we're not so sure about this renewable stuff, it's still pretty expensive. But eventually they got persuaded there was no credible alternative. If you were going to claim you had a climate policy, you had to get some of this stuff built, and it was pretty clear the only way you were going to get it built is through long-term contracts. And at least this was competitive, right? It was at least speaking to the Conservative view that you want markets, you want competitive forces. So after 2.5 years, they said, okay, we'll run another auction. That was the result. The price that came in for the 4.5 year construction was £57. So the initial gains from moving to a competitive pressure were followed by further remarkable progress. Roughly half the cost of capital, the cost of the loan, not the cost of building it, but the cost of financing was no longer 6% a year, it was 3% a year. If you're spending maybe £3 billion on a wind farm, that makes a big difference. Because the finance sector said, this stuff seems to work and these contracts seem to be robust and they've survived political cycles, and we're finding it pretty hard to make money, and 3% a year is good enough, real. A lot of technology learning, scale economics, supply chain development, overall halving the cost of the electricity. And this is in the North Sea, which is very windy, and also especially windy in winter, which is when we need the power. So this is actually really a major new resource, and the UK industry has now got heavily involved. And I'll say a little bit more about this. Just again, huge scepticism, followed by huge cost reductions from pan-European. It wasn't just UK, although the UK has been a big player. What do these costs mean? Don't worry about all of those things. I just thought, well, there's lots of things you need to think about Is it the final retail price? Is it industrial electricity price? Is it other sources? Lots of ways. But basically, this was pretty close to the cost of industrial electricity prices, actually a bit below. Then, just last month, things got even more interesting. We had the third auction, and the price is down to £40 per megawatt hour. £40 a megawatt hour is cheaper than the wholesale electricity price in Europe. I mean, and actually, I was reminded that 5 years ago we had a debate that the industry was claiming it could get costs down if it had sustained support, could get costs down to 100. And now they're signing contracts at 40. So this has been pretty radical. And if you really want a view of something a bit radical, you have the German and Dutch transmission company Tenet now saying, well, actually, what we should really do now is build an artificial island in the middle of the North Sea and just roll out the wind industry from there. It's like, we kind of got used to thinking only the Chinese think at this kind of scale. But really what it means is wind energy in Northern Europe is now, in my view, you can do a back of the envelope calculation and it's going to be as valuable as natural gas was for the last 2-3 decades. It's our major new energy resource. So let me then come on to, and I will start linking this back to the innovation dimension, but I just wanted to flag also that what has happened on the overall picture of UK electricity in some ways even more dramatic, because what you have here, the blue line going up and down, is UK coal generation from 2005. Goes up and down because every winter it's colder, you use a lot more coal for electricity. Right. So for 7-8 years after 2005, it was bumping around. The green is the European carbon price. You probably, most of you know, Europe has a pan-European carbon market. It's been unfortunately rather unstable. One's tempted to say, nice try, but it didn't work very well. But there were periods with quite high carbon prices, but they didn't actually make that much difference. Now, then in 2013, you have the red coming in, which is the UK carbon floor price that I referred to, which was basically a top-up. It said, well, if the European price isn't high enough, we'll add on a tax to UK generators. And this was set to rise in predictable ways to reflect the social estimated the cost of carbon emissions. And as that kicked in, UK coal went down and down and down and down and down. In April 27, Britain had its first hours without any coal power for over a century. Now, well, then we had days at a time. Now we've got weeks at a time. UK CO2 emissions have halved from the power sector, and actually our national emissions are lower than they were a century ago. Now, I accept that probably says something about how much Britain was emitting a century ago, but even so, it's you know, it's at least moving in the right direction at last. The policy point I wanted to make is economists will be tempted to say, see, it's all about carbon pricing. And actually be careful, it's not all about carbon pricing. It's actually about a combination of policies, because this was a period we had quite strong energy efficiency policies, partly because of the European target, and our electricity demand for the first time started going down. So great, electricity demand is going down. We had this rapid ramp up in renewable energy, so renewable energy was coming up quite fast. And we have a whole mix of coal and gas plants. And 10 years ago, when you had a high carbon price, we kind of needed most of both of them. And, you know, they might flip around a bit. 10 years later, with demand coming down and renewables coming up, when the carbon price went up, it made it cheaper to run gas plants than coal plants, and there was nowhere left for the coal to go. There was simply no use for the coal plants, and so they basically just began closing left and right and centre. The government didn't actually force it. They just became completely uneconomic because nobody needed them. So we've closed most of our coal plants. The government is now committed to closing the last by 2023. but probably the companies will actually beat them to it because they're just not worth running. So that's been quite something to live through and observe. It has, I think, by most respects, been a revolution in the UK electricity system. The revolution, I think, is much broader. And I just wanted to make a brief point about the electricity before I return to the wider themes. Just to stress, and you probably all know this, the revolution is occurring at both ends of the system. You may find some people who think that the new world of electricity and solar is all going to be nice and small and cuddly, and it's all about smart distributed generation and nobody needs the grid anymore. Let me tell you, if you have hundreds of gigawatts of wind in the North Sea, you need a grid. And you need an interconnected grid connecting the different European countries to manage the flows and the flows of wind across the North Sea, and et cetera, et cetera. So the point is not, hey, we no longer need a transmission system. We need it more than ever, but its role has changed fundamentally. It is no longer simply a vehicle for taking vast amounts of power and shunting it down to passive consumers. It's a platform on which to manage the interchange of electricity in both directions according to time and location, and therefore its economic model of managing the transmission system will also have to change. The more you look at this, the more you realise technologies always have to go along with institutional and regulatory change as well before you can remotely get the best out of the technologies. So, I've been probably talking about 35, 40 minutes. Is it okay to spend just a little bit saying a bit more about the sort of theoretical framework? So if you're not too tired, I'm actually going to put more of an analytic academic hat on for the next bit, against that more sort of factual background. But I think it's, I don't know, my career has partly been interweaving the practical and the theoretical. So here's the theory bit. And this is particularly for either the economists in the room or for the engineers who can't understand why economists think the way they do. So from an economics perspective, yes, sorry.
Hi, Mr. Grant. My name is Megha. Sorry to interrupt you in the beginning. I come from International Solar Alliance. I'm leading strategic communication for International Solar Alliance. So I'm very happy to be here and you are benefiting from what you said. So I just wanted to have a quick comment from your side. Last year, Prime Minister Modi said and spoke about one world, one sun and one.
If you're not in a hurry, could we have it after he's finished? Because there will be a question answer session.
I thought he's finished.
No, yet. So he'll finish his lecture, then we'll have a discussion.
So, yeah, sorry, I'll try not to take too long. I'll probably covered a bit too much ground, but I do think it's useful to set out some theory first, and then let's come back to the sort of more applied. So this will seem a bit weird at first, but you'll see the reason I talk about it. It's a really, really simple graph. For anyone who's got used to any kind of economics, what's economics about? It's basically about how we take resources, which is the vertical here. It can be energy, any resource you think of. Here I'm interested in energy or emissions or the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb all of the CO2 that we're throwing into it. And you want to maximize your economic output or your GDP or your consumption or your welfare or whatever you call it, I don't mind. You want to move to the right. What we call sometimes a technology frontier or a best practice frontier is basically the set of technological options that we have for translating resources into economic output, economic value or welfare. Coal is useless if you don't have a technology that will, none of us actually eat coal, etc. Economics would be fantastically boring if that was the only thing, but of course our economies have hundreds of thousands of millions of different resource inputs, and there's very good theory as to why markets are the best way of basically allowing people to make trade-offs between all those different resources based on all of the technologies that they have, assuming that everyone is behaving as an optimizing agent. They're trying to minimize the resource cost inputs and maximize their output. They want to be at the frontier, of course. Why wouldn't they be? Fine. Usually in an economics textbook, you just draw it as a straight line, and then you call that a supply curve, and you put on a demand curve, and you have a nice equilibrium. That's not where I'm going. And the next point is, I'm not sure I've ever met anybody at the frontier. I mean, how many of you woke up this morning and thought, I'm going to optimize my energy use this morning? All right? Hands up, come on. I mean, I didn't. Hey! Someone optimized. Right, okay. We can talk offline about what you did. People, real people and real organizations and real governments are not really operating at the frontier. They're not making the best use of all of the options they have. They're often surprisingly far. And that's particularly true for energy efficiency, for reasons I could talk about but I won't, or for new innovations where they just haven't really got used to it, or you don't have the systems. Now, in the book that I mentioned, we try to develop a sort of neutral language around this. We say, hey, let's start with how real people behave. There is some economics work around this. It was called satisficing. In general, we call it first domain economics. If you like, the economic theory of actually ordinary real world behavior. That means the neoclassical theory, where you assume that agents are calculating and optimizing all of their trade-offs, is like second domain economics. And then you think, wait a minute, this frontier moves. Over time, that thing moves to the right, and thank goodness it does. It means we get more welfare out of the same inputs, or even out of less inputs. But then there's a really interesting question. And economics is fine with that. It's called productivity improvement. Great. What we have a much less understanding of is, yeah, but how does that frontier move, and in what direction, and how fast, and why? Because now we're in a world where we really care. If I go back for a second, if we can have lots of innovation, if we're thinking about energy and emissions, that will take us up and to the right. We've had it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Shale revolution. Fantastic innovation. Unbelievable innovation that's enabled us to get a lot more oil. It's enabled us to find brilliant ways of messing up the atmosphere much more cheaply, to be absolutely blunt. That's what it's done, right? It's opened up a whole new massive reservoir of carbon that we can throw into the atmosphere more cheaply, and then have intense debates about whether that's really such a smart thing to have worked out how to do. What we really want is innovation that will take us in directions that use less resources, less pollution, and ideally at least as fast, or preferably even faster, so that we improve welfare by innovating in a low carbon direction. That's the name of the game. That's the innovation challenge, and that is what in the book we call, if you like, the science of third domain economics, which is all about transformation. So the point to make here is the following. First, understand the assumptions upon which different theories are based. They're all based on, perfectly good theories. The optimization, second domain, is classic. You assume relative prices, which are cost reflective, representative agents, everybody's behaving the same way to minimize input costs, maximize benefits. You have rational expectations, stable preferences, and stable technology trends. They are the foundational assumptions of most neoclassical and welfare economics. That first domain, satisficing, you're looking at habits, myopia, inattention, contractual failures, principal agent failure, all the sorts of reasons why actually reality doesn't quite work that way. We've got well-developed science and Nobel Prizes for behavioral and organizational economics, and you could argue development sciences. Transforming domain, things are changing. Everything's changing. The structure of the economy is changing, the technologies are changing, the institutions are changing, to the point where it's actually really hard to sit down and say, I'm going to do a cost-benefit calculation and I'm going to do this. You're in a realm much more of strategizing in policy terms, and the toolbox is broadly evolutionary and institutional economics. Now, I've lived part of my life in economic departments, and I've seen warfare between these different camps, and I'm not very interested in that, because the point is they describe different processes that occur at different scales. So if you really think about this satisficing behavioral domain, it's mostly about individuals with relatively short time horizons. A few months, a couple of years. Markets, generally a couple of years to a couple of decades. it's pretty rare, certainly to find a financial market that's looking more than 10, 20 years ahead, and most of them consider that extremely long term. The transforming domain and processes, you're potentially looking at the timescales of technological diffusion around the globe over many decades. And again, the social scale is increasing. So these are all describing processes that are ongoing, but they're describing different processes on different timescales. And I can say a bit more about that. So if I jump from there back to the rather applied world of European policy, I tend to draw something like this. Again, it's not long since even, well-established economists and economic institutions like the OECD said, hey, we've got a climate problem. What we should just do is have a nice simple greenhouse gas target and a carbon price, and that will solve the problem. And anything else is more expensive and is a really bad idea. Well, I disagree again. If you are dealing with agents that are behaving the way the textbook economist says they should, and they have rational expectations which are some vague approximation to reality, yeah, markets and pricing may be a good idea. They're usually actually the most highest relevant and most effective instrument. Now, you can also have impact on the other domains. If you were to double the energy price in India, you could argue that will be a great way of making a lot of people notice how much energy they're wasting and getting them to do something about it. Probably they would vote even Modi out of office a lot more quickly. People don't like governments ramping up their energy price. It's a really dumb way to try and drive energy efficiency when the problem is not that they've sat down and rationally calculated that it's optimal to be highly inefficient. It's not. You've got much more effective instruments around efficiency standards or just engagement. Do you realise how much money you're wasting? You basically do things that help either choice edit or lead people towards making smarter choices. If you're trying to transform the system, you have to get involved in strategic investment, which is basically any investment for which the public benefit is going to be bigger than any private entity could command. Put it like that, there's loads of it. You start with education, roads, railways, right? We're really used to strategic investment. It's just we're not really used to it when it's in an area like energy where we've been desperately trying to build markets and say, oh, well, government should do this. But you can't avoid it, right? There's got to be a public role in here if you want to change fundamentally a system and its technologies. I'm going to skip the academic bit here. People who are interested can come back and study this slide. It says actually there are very deep mathematical and theoretical differences underlying these different domains. I will just draw attention to one aspect of this, which is that whereas there's a good theory that a purely second domain world is self-optimizing, providing you have the prices right, there's absolutely no theoretical reason to think that either first or third domain processes are self-optimizing. That means you have lots of theoretical potential for co-benefits, either by the ways you improve efficiencies or the way that you drive innovation. I'll come back to the European target approach. Various people said Europe is crazy to have these three different things if all we're talking about is one goal. I beg to differ. The EU listened very carefully to people saying this is a crazy thing to do and decided to carry on doing exactly the same thing, which was 3 more targets for 2030, only this time it's a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases, 32% in a final energy as renewables, and 32.5% in energy efficiency, and 15% of interconnection. And I think, based on what I just showed you, there's a lot of logic in that. I mean, it's not perfect matching, but it's pretty good. You need different instruments for different aspects of the challenge. Now, I will draw towards conclusions, but just to think 3 more slides I'd like to run through quickly, if I may. Sorry, I know I've covered a lot of ground. The first is a bit of an odd one, but forgive me, I quite like it. I think it says something tricky but interesting, which is actually the following. And it is trying to come back to step back and say, well, what do wider international data tell us? I only had data on OECD. We looked at price data, and we looked not just at prices but at costs. There's a difference, right? So vertically, I have the end-use price in these different countries, added up across all electricity transport, etc. Horizontally is energy intensity, i.e. how efficiently countries are using energy, or the productivity besides GDP per unit energy. There's a rather interesting feature in this graph. Actually, it's captured pretty well by straight lines that go up from the middle. What does that mean? That means basically all these countries are spending somewhere between 6 and 10% of their GDP on energy, which is quite interesting because some of them have energy prices. So take Japan. It's got energy prices twice as high as the United States, but it spends less on energy. Why? How? Because it's more than twice as efficient. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. It is not that countries, as I said, hit their populations over the head. It was we had the oil shocks. Japan said, geez, we've got a major strategic structural problem. They poured money into R&D, into infrastructure, as well as sustaining high prices when the oil prices crashed. And conversely, the countries in red were the countries of Eastern Europe that insulated themselves from the oil shocks, said cheap energy is good for development, and actually, when they finally could no longer sustain the level of subsidies, they moved to market prices, and they ended up with some of the most expensive energy in the world. I don't mean in price terms, but in cost terms, they were spending 12, 15% of their GDP on energy. That is a huge economic burden. Why? Because their infrastructure was just horribly inefficient in every way imaginable. Buildings with bad insulation and no metering at all, industries that were like 50 years old, and you can't adjust that overnight. So I think that's really interesting, but it's a really interesting stylized fact that whatever the carbon price, given a few energy price, given a few decades to adjust with the right mix of policies, countries seem to end up spending roughly the same proportion of income on energy. And I could talk about some theoretical reasons why we think there's pretty fundamental reasons for that. So finally, penultimate slide, I think if I return to this, I now think of this in the following way. If you want to understand innovation, you have to understand you can't only talk about innovation. Or to be more precise, you can't only talk about technology. You have to also, as you go through all of these stages, think about the companies and their organizations and their supply chains which develop and change all along that journey. You have to think about the customers and about the development of the standards that gives consumers and companies in the supply chain confidence the thing will work and will fit, etc. That all changes along the journey. The nature of financing changes radically. You start with public or maybe self-funded R&D, you move into project grants, you move into the venture capital, market, The market regulation has to change. It is never one regulation fits all. It has to evolve. That's what I've shown you in the UK. The institutions have to change to reflect the emergence of new technologies and their interests, and the infrastructures have to change. Very roughly, I've walked you on a journey through those three domains because we've deliberately ordered that according to the sort of the scale of changes. That's a really complicated diagram in a way, but the concepts aren't that difficult, right? Innovation is a multi-domain journey across many things in our economies. It's not just a bunch of geeks coming up with a nice new technology and expecting it to dominate the world. So a final slide, pretty much, which is what do we draw from this more generally and strategically in the energy and climate world? Well, I never quite know how well the slide works, but it tries to convey a sense of the future coming towards you. And on the left-hand valley, you have effectively a green energy future. On the right-hand valley, a brown energy future. Both involve investment, both involve innovation, but on the brown fossil fuel-based future, you are digging more into less conventional energy sources. You may get involved in synthetic oil for transport, lower capital costs, but higher fuel costs, higher dependence upon international fossil fuel markets, and you are almost unavoidably accumulating a host of environmental issues, even climate aside. The green future tends to be more integrated, more highly innovative, more IT, higher efficiency, more interconnection between sectors, more electricity, electric vehicles, how do they relate, how do those batteries get used to feed back and balance, more capital intensive but much lower operating costs. The fundamental point is the left-hand valley is not just a higher cost version of the right-hand valley. It is something fundamentally different. And we are in the process of creating and deciding which kind of futures are we trying to create here. And that, I think, is perhaps the most fundamental conclusion that I've come to from this sort of journey that I've been on in the sort of partly the European context. And, I forgot, sorry, I had the fact that it's that journey that has now given the UK, should we say, the confidence to take a deep breath and pass binding legislation that by 2050 the UK, to use the Prime Minister's words, will have ended its contribution to global warming. Net zero contributions. And I think I've taken long enough. I could say a bit about the analysis and the economics that have led us there, but let me just say one of the key slides in that analysis and in the economic evaluation was 10 years on now, looks like it's the cost of getting to net zero will be no more expensive than 10 years ago we thought the cost of getting 80% down was. And that was actually no more expensive than previously what we thought the cost of getting 60% down was. So boy, are we learning and are we gaining confidence that we can actually do this providing we try. On that note, I'll finish.
This has been a really privileged evening for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions. I would request that since time is short, because we have to leave at 8:30, I'm told. So please ask questions. Keep your comments for discussion in the corridor. Yeah, please.
Quick question. What you said for the UK, sitting here in India, is it replicable? And how fast?
I'm very sorry, but that has to be a question you answer, not me. You know India better than I do. I can only tell you what seems to have worked in Britain and why it worked. Sorry.
Please.
I think you could hear me.
Listening to you, we discovered that it is more of a technological journey as well as a personal journey towards commitment and change of behavior. This touches upon many social issues that we encounter, our culture, and the way we have come up so far. This journey, from this social point of view, is not easy. I would like to see how politics can be taken separate from what the world needs.
May I make your task easier? Let me take a few questions together.
Okay, sure.
So this is one question. Anybody else with a question? Yeah, you had
Yes,
a
sir.
question or a comment?
I wanted Mr. Krat's comment on this.
So it's a question then.
Good evening. Entirely my privilege to be here, sir. So last year, Honorable Prime Minister of India spoke about this one world, one sun and one grid concept. One world, one sun, one grid. And that he spoke in the inaugural of the first assembly of the International Solar Alliance, where United Nations Secretary General was also there. And this concept was picked up, and I've been privy to the discussions that keep happening in the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy around this topic. Although I am neither equipped nor talented enough to understand it completely, but it intrigues me. And I just wanted to have a quick comment from you, as you spoke about that EU has a success story of energy liberalization and the trade of energy freely that happens within the European Union. So I would just like to have a quick comment from your side that whether it is possible. I mean, so that's the question I wanted to.
Please.
Professor Grubb, this is Subbu from National Solar Energy Federation of India. We are the bridge between industry and government. I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. I have one simple question which directly intertwines with the title. How important do you think industrial innovation is directly related to policy innovation? Because I am guilty of asking this because we are trying to take cue from it. The context here is that British Petroleum is now calling itself as Beyond Petroleum. So how do you think factors like this influence innovative policy?
Any other questions? Do you have questions? And may I ask a question also? Sure. Since we have a couple of minutes, so one assumption which you said towards the end of getting to net carbon neutrality is a similar movement down the price curve or cost curve. Any other key ingredients in that? Because to take his question forward, if we need an intelligent discussion in this country, that can we think of net carbon neutrality by 2050, it would be a paradigm shift in all our thinking. But what are the kind of questions we need to ask? What are the things we need to examine to have an intelligent discussion on it, rather than just that? Because one entrenched view in India has been that we are a late mover in industrialization, we are at an early stage of development, so we need more time. So if you have to have an intelligent conversation here, then the kind of things you looked at would become relevant for us. Any other question from anybody else? Yeah.
Why we are confining only to zero neutrality? Why not negative by 2050?
Give us a chance. Yeah. So the first question was really about the sort of policy and politics. And again, it's not for me to really comment on what the political landscape looks like in India. I can tell you observations about how it's happened in the UK, and you can have a whole lecture on the politics. And there were some really tough moments, and there were some happy accidents, and there were some surprising paradoxes. I think I hinted right at the beginning or early on about one of the surprising paradoxes, which is it was because we had so much coal domestically that we had a dominant miners' union that had a devastating strike, which created a government that hated the coal industry and would do almost anything to reduce our dependence on coal. And it was a right-wing conservative government led by Mrs. Thatcher, a very strong personality, also a scientist who understood the science of climate change and also liked nuclear power, and thought, so for lots of reasons, she put climate change on the agenda. She told British business, this is a real problem and you have to be involved in solving it. So the UK was fortunate that it was never a left-right polarised issue. Right from the outset, there was a business council, the UK chaired the science working group of the IPCC, UK science was a strong player, and it became an establishment consensus that climate change was a real problem and somehow we had to get to grips with it. There were some moral elements also thrown in. There was a bit of a struggle within the conservative movement. There were the skeptics that don't believe the expert people, but there was also some religious elements, like saying it's God's creation, we don't want to mess it up, and there were others saying, look, we actually led the Industrial Revolution, we've done more than any country to cause this problem, we have a moral obligation to help try and solve it. So all those currents going into the political discourse. We had initially the fact that a market-friendly approach to the electricity system also delivered the first phase of rapid decarbonisation. drawing upon another natural resource of gas displacing coal, so that fitted quite well into the narrative. Then you had an election which brought in a centre-left government that was maybe a bit more willing to use, actually go away from the oversimplified it's all got to be markets narrative. They took on board we need a carbon price, a business tax. Business had been sort of supportive, then business said, oh, we really don't want to be taxed with this, and there was a political battle, and there was a sort of fudge compromise which used some of the money to support low carbon innovation and increase industrial efficiency, but the tax stayed. The Treasury got used to the idea that actually you can really make some useful money out of carbon pricing or business energy taxes. And all the while the pressure was building up, the scientific evidence was accumulating, and then the next phase was the battle that I talked around electricity, which was, well, it's not just that the market as we've designed it may have been great for bringing in gas and killing off UK mining industry, but it's never going to deliver low carbon investment. And even that probably wouldn't have been enough if it hadn't have been for the regulator. Oh, by the way, one minor thing in the story I forgot, but it's really fascinating. I say, sorry, no country can duplicate another's politics, but you asked about the elements. These are the elements. There was real tension in the first decade between the Tony Blair government saying decarbonisation, climate change, it's part of the UK's moral responsibilities along with Africa, and saying we need renewable energy, signing up to a very ambitious renewable target. The energy regulator saying, we're not going to do this. We're an independent regulator. This is going to drive up bills. We don't want energy bills to go up. A result of that political battle was 2008 Energy Act changed, sort of, the duties of the regulator, which had been to protect consumers. Some of you may have heard this before. I've said it before in India. How did they do it? They had a huge fight. Should the regulator have duties on sustainable development or decarbonisation? Eventually, the only political consensus was insert 3 words. The regulator has duties to protect present and future consumers. In fact, my job with the regulator came up because they said, what the hell does it mean to protect future consumers? We better find someone here who can talk electricity economics but seems to be interested in sustainability. And that then led to a fundamental change in how we evaluate how the electricity sector performs. So the sort of introduction of the future into the metrics of the present was another part of the story. But of course the innovation then enormously helped, that it was clear it wasn't going to dramatically drive up future prices in the long term. So, all of those things came together with the regulator then saying, we've created such a fiercely competitive market. It's been great for driving prices down so much that nobody's actually going to invest anything because the price is now entirely based on shorter and marginal prices and there's no way to recover any capital costs. It's not going to work. The lights are going to go out. Well, if your regulator tells you the lights are going to go out, you have to reform it somehow anyway. So that's what enabled the final EMR. And believe me, every stage of this has involved political battles. There were furious articles written by senior economists saying this is an outrage, this is Britain abandoning market principles when we should be leading the world on how to run competitive markets and other such rubbish. But anyway, that was a really long answer to the first question, I apologise. But every country has its windows of political opportunity, and the key is never giving up. Sooner or later, windows open, and you need to have prepared the intellectual ground to seize those political opportunities. On Modi, one world, one sun, one grid. I think if you can give us about 50 years, he's probably right. Well, maybe we don't have that long, maybe we don't need that long. That wasn't a facetious answer, though. It's reflecting, I think there is quite a good economic logic for kind of one world, one grid visions. Right, there's sun shining somewhere, everywhere. A sun's shining, all of the time. It's just if it's on the wrong side of the planet, But I think the visions that will go out there and build a global grid are fundamentally mistaken. No. I mean, conceivably you could argue that's what BRI, Belt Road Initiative, is trying to do, maybe. The reality is, in Europe we've talked about what's it called, Desertec. Build lots of solar energy in the Sahara and build a massive grid for the whole of North Africa and Europe interconnected. Spent 10 years talking. Very little has happened in reality, because these constructions have to come from the bottom up. There has to be a perceived need, there has to be a perceived market value from somebody, and then you say, oh, well, actually, we'd like to build this, we'd like to build this next interconnector, we can do bigger and better and connect this interconnected grid with that one there, that will be really valuable. And we trust the other partner. You can't build it if you fundamentally distrust that you've built this really important interconnector and then they use it as a political weapon, right? You've got to have some trust that the system's going to play by the rules. And our own story I didn't mention is we've now got lots more interconnection with the continent, partly because we've did this as part of the European Union and with its integrated structures, and also because we got the right regulatory structure, which basically was a sort of mix of private and public, but it sets a floor and a ceiling on the revenues, which took the risk of a company completely going bankrupt by building an interconnector and then the government changing the rules. It basically guaranteed that at minimum they would cover their costs. And then suddenly we had a whole flood of investment into interconnectors. So that's also been another story. But there is no global government that's going to build a global grid. There are a set of companies and countries that are going to gradually gain confidence it's worth doing it and worth taking the next steps. Industrial innovation compared with policy innovation, BP, beyond petroleum. I think something in the human brain seems to want simple single answers. It's either this or it's that. And the economics version is it's carbon pricing, not other things. And then other people say, no, it's got to be innovation, not carbon pricing. Come on, it's got to be innovation and carbon pricing and efficiency, and they kind of go along. I think it's a bit like this. If a major company says, oh, we're going to go carbon neutral and the energy is really expensive and governments are going to do nothing, then that company is going to go bankrupt in the end. If a government says we're going to go carbon neutral and its entire energy sector is totally carbon intensive and has no capacity to do anything in low carbon, in most countries they will succeed in blocking the government doing anything. So, again, in Britain, I think we've been fortunate. We had a period where BP was very progressive, and it said, climate change is a real problem. We're going to have to solve it. I've had a change of CEO. You hear less of that from BP. You hear more of it from Shell now. Shell has actually changed its corporate reward structure such that managers get reduced for reducing not only their own carbon, but the carbon in their product. They're rewarding their managers to sell less oil. That's quite something if you're an oil-based company. And they're trying to work out how to become an electricity company because they see electricity and electric vehicles as the future value. You've got to have companies which are also thinking strategically as well as the governments. And then you can really get things done and get into the positive sum as opposed to the negative sum dialogue about, okay, how can we maximise our competitive value in a low-carbon economy? That's where you want to get to. And I think I've sort of in that and also answered your question.
Yes. So thank you very much. It's been really a delightful evening and intellectually one of the most stimulating lectures I've attended.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Oh, be warned, the book is a bit of a big beast, but if anyone's interested.
Well, thank you all for being here, and please turn up for the next lecture in the series next month. Thank you.
Thank you.